In 1988, a seasoned fisherman from a small Maine village vanished after setting out to sea, leaving behind whispers of storm and betrayal. 15 years later, his trawler is discovered frozen in ice with a logbook inside, unraveling a trail of smuggling, secrets, and the chilling truth of what really happened that night. The wind off the Atlantic carried a sharp bite that October morning in 1988, the kind that crept into the bones no matter how many layers you wore. Down at the docks of Harrington, Maine, the harbor was already awake, with the clatter of nets and the low rumble of engines warming beneath pale gray skies. Among the boats bobbing at their moorings, one stood out for its neat lines and freshly painted trim. The Marian Belle was Daniel Mercer's pride, a sturdy trawler named for his late mother, and that morning it waited with quiet patience as he made his preparations. Daniel was no stranger to these waters. At 38, he had spent his life reading the sea's moods, knowing when its surface promised a good catch and when it threatened danger. He carried himself with the kind of calm that made others trust him, and though storms could rise without warning, few doubted his skill at bringing his boat home safely. Claire, his wife, stood at the edge of the dock with their teenage son Matthew, watching as he secured the last of the gear. "You'll be back before nightfall," Claire said, though it sounded less like a question and more like a plea. Daniel gave her the easy smile she knew so well. "Before you even miss me," he promised, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Keep an eye on things here, Matt. I'll bring you back something worth bragging about." The sea was restless, the horizon cloaked in a haze that blurred sky and water into a single slate-colored band. Still, Daniel pushed off, guiding the Marian Belle into the open water with steady hands. Those on the dock watched until the boat shrank to a speck against the pale morning light, then vanished into the mist. By late afternoon, the wind had stiffened and the waves grew taller. Other boats began returning, their crews tired but satisfied, yet the Marian Belle did not appear. Dusk fell, then night, and by the following morning, the absence had become a shadow over the harbor. Radios crackled with calls, the Coast Guard deployed search vessels, and the village held its breath. Daniel Mercer had not come home, and for the first time, no one could say with certainty that he ever would. The search began before the sun was fully up, with the Coast Guard sweeping the coastline and local fishermen volunteering their own vessels to scour the waters. From the air, helicopters traced wide arcs over the churning sea, their spotlights glinting off restless waves. For 3 days the search pressed on, men and women combing every inlet, every rocky outcrop where a trawler might have run aground. Nets floated empty in the tide, gulls circled hungrily overhead, but there was no sign of the Marian Belle or the man who had steered her into the fog. Back in Harrington, the Mercer home became the heart of an anxious vigil. Claire kept a pot of coffee brewing that no one touched, her hands trembling each time the phone rang. Matthew sat by the window, watching the horizon, as if sheer willpower might summon his father's boat back to the harbor. Neighbors came with casseroles and quiet words, but even their presence carried the weight of inevitability. In a town that lived and died by the sea, everyone understood what it meant when a fisherman didn't return. Rumors began to ripple through the harbor. Some insisted the storm had swallowed the Marian Belle whole, dragging it to the ocean floor. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting Daniel had debts or secrets that had finally caught up with him. A few muttered that perhaps he had chosen to disappear, leaving his family behind for reasons no one could know. Each theory cut differently, but all carried the same sting. The Coast Guard officially called off the search on the 5th day, citing worsening weather and dwindling hope. A short statement was issued, naming Daniel Mercer as presumed lost at sea. For Claire, the words struck like a hammer. Presumed meant there was no body, no wreckage, nothing tangible to hold on to. She clung to the absence as proof that somewhere, somehow, Daniel might still be alive. The dockside community held a small memorial, lanterns lit and set afloat on the tide, their flickering reflections drifting out into the dark. One lantern carried Matthew's handwriting across its paper shell. "Come home, Dad." It bobbed in the current, slowly swallowed by the night, a fragile plea against the immensity of the sea's silence. The years that followed settled heavily over the Mercer family. Claire kept the house much as it had been the day Daniel left, his boots still by the back door, his fishing cap resting on a peg near the kitchen. At first it was a way of holding on to hope, but as months turned into years, the objects hardened into relics of a life that had been cut away. Matthew grew up in the shadow of that absence, his father's name often spoken in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might reopen wounds the town had never truly allowed to heal. By the mid-1990s, the story of Daniel Mercer had become part of Harrington's harbor lore. Fishermen still spoke of him over pints at the tavern, some with reverence for his skill, others with skepticism over the mystery that lingered. A few still clung to the notion that he had vanished by choice, a rumor that Matthew met with clenched fists more than once. To him, his father had been a man of integrity, not someone who would abandon family for an easier road. Yet without evidence, doubt settled in like salt air, impossible to brush away. Claire aged more quickly than her years, the strain of unanswered questions carving lines around her eyes. She attended church faithfully, her prayers quiet but insistent, as if persistence might eventually wear down whatever wall had hidden Daniel from them. Every so often, she would walk the docks alone, pausing at the slip where the Marian Belle once moored, staring at the water as though expecting the vessel to appear from the mist, whole and unchanged. Matthew left for college, but carried his father's ghost with him. Every return to Harrington felt like stepping back into a story that refused to end, the missing boat a wound that never closed. Each visit, he noticed how the community still carried Daniel's disappearance like unfinished business, a mystery spoken of in hushed tones when storms rolled in or when another fisherman was lost to the sea. 15 years passed this way, the Mercer family bound to absence rather than presence, their lives shaped not by what had been found, but by what had never been recovered. Then, during one of the harshest winters the coast had seen in decades, the ice began to shift in a secluded cove miles from Harrington, and something long buried by sea and time slowly emerged into the light. The winter of 2003 locked the Maine coast in ice, thicker than anyone could remember. Lobster traps sat useless on shore, docks groaned beneath snowdrifts, and boats were lashed tight, resigned to waiting out the season. One morning, as the tide pulled back against the frozen shore of a narrow cove north of Harrington, a local trapper named Elijah Briggs spotted something caught in the sheet of ice. At first, it seemed no different than the usual driftwood or wreckage that surfaced when the tides shifted, but as he moved closer, his breath caught. The shape wasn't splintered wood or sea trash, it was a bow, weathered but intact, jutting from the ice like a relic suspended in glass. Elijah climbed down carefully, chipping at the frozen edges with the butt of his axe. Faded paint clung stubbornly to the hull, letters emerging one by one beneath the frost. When the full name came clear, he stumbled back, the sound of his breath filling the silence of the cove. The Marian Belle. The news spread quickly through Harrington. By noon, townspeople gathered along the edge of the frozen inlet, staring at the ghostly outline trapped beneath the surface. The boat seemed eerily preserved, locked in time, as though the sea had decided to return what it had taken 15 years earlier. Some crossed themselves, others muttered about curses, but all understood the weight of what had been found. Authorities were called, and by the next day, crews began the painstaking work of cutting the trawler free from its icy tomb. Chains groaned, saws screamed against the frozen crust, and slowly the Marian Belle rose back into the air, dripping with brine and shards of ice that glittered in the pale winter sun. For Claire, the news was both a knife and a balm. She sat at her kitchen table as neighbors whispered around her, the name of the boat passing from mouth to mouth like an incantation. Matthew drove through the night from Boston, his heart pounding with questions he had never been able to quiet. When he arrived at the cove, he stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had once worked beside his father, staring at the Marian Belle as it rested again above water. It was no longer a story, no longer just memory. The boat had returned, and with it came the promise of answers and perhaps truths no one was ready to face. The Marian Belle was towed carefully into Harrington's harbor, her hull streaked with salt and ice, her rigging stiff as if frozen mid-motion. Crowds lined the pier despite the biting cold, their breath rising in clouds as they watched the boat return to the same waters it had left 15 years before. The trawler looked less like a wreck than a vessel caught between worlds, time having preserved it in ways that defied expectation. Nets still hung from their hooks, a coffee mug lay on its side near the wheelhouse, and a pair of worn boots sat neatly tucked under a bench. It was as though Daniel had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. Investigators moved cautiously through the deck, photographing every detail before entering the cabin. The air inside was heavy with damp and decay, but nothing suggested the violent ruin of a storm. Cabinets remained latched, tools were stacked in their places, and Daniel's oilskin coat hung from a peg by the door. The only thing missing was the man himself. When the Coast Guard released their initial findings, they admitted confusion. There was no evidence of capsizing or fire, no hull damage that would explain why the vessel had gone missing. Even stranger, the boat's clock, long since rusted, had stopped at 11:47, its hands locked as though recording the exact moment something had ended. Matthew walked the deck himself once investigators cleared it, his gloved fingers trailing the wood his father had once polished. Memories flooded back Daniel's laughter carrying over the engine's hum, his steady voice calling out instructions, the smell of diesel and salt that clung to his jacket. For Matthew, standing there was like stepping into the past, only to find it hollow. Claire could not bring herself to visit the boat. She remained at home, clutching the phone when Matthew called with updates, her voice trembling as she asked whether they had found anything at all that explained what had happened. Each time, Matthew answered with the same bitter truth. The Marian Belle had returned, but it carried only silence. What lay inside the trawler raised more questions than it answered. For Harrington, the return of the vessel reignited an old wound. For Matthew, it was the beginning of a search, not for a body, but for the truth that had hidden beneath the surface all those years. The Marian Belle was moved to a secured dock, where investigators could continue their work without interruption from curious townsfolk. Even so, people still gathered along the shoreline, staring across the water at the ghostly trawler, trading theories in low voices. For Harrington, it felt as though time had folded back on itself, the old wound reopened with a fresh sting. Inside the boat, investigators found the logbook tucked in a drawer beneath the navigation console. The leather cover was swollen from years of damp, its pages brittle, but much of the writing remained legible. Daniel's neat handwriting filled the lines, detailing catches, weather notes, and routine maintenance. Everything was ordinary until the final entry. It was dated October 17, 1988, the night he vanished. Daniel had written of mechanical trouble with the port engine, noting that he would attempt repairs once he set his nets. The entry shifted halfway down the page, the handwriting jagged as if written in haste. He mentioned another vessel spotted nearby, one he didn't recognize, and a line that read only, "Strange lights on the water." The entry ended abruptly, the pen's last stroke trailing into nothing. When Matthew was allowed to see the log, he traced the familiar loops of his father's script, his throat tightening. To anyone else it was just words on paper, but to him it was his father's voice reaching across 15 years. He could picture Daniel bent over the small desk in the cabin, brow furrowed, recording every detail with the same steady diligence he had taught his son to respect. The mention of the unknown vessel ignited speculation across town. Some believed it to be a smuggler's boat, others thought it might have been a Coast Guard cutter gone unrecorded. A few dismissed it as a trick of light on storm-tossed waves. But Matthew could not let it go. The words carried weight, the tone different from the calm observations that filled the rest of the log. Something had unsettled his father that night. As the logbook was sealed into evidence, Matthew stood on the dock staring at the Marian Belle. He knew storms could take men, but storms didn't write half-finished sentences or leave a boat intact and abandoned. Whatever had happened on that October night, the sea had not been the only witness. Word of the logbook spread quickly through Harrington, and before long the tavern buzzed each evening with speculation. Men who had spent their lives on the water leaned across tables, lowering their voices as they argued about the meaning of Daniel's final words. Some swore the strange lights he described were nothing more than the reflection of lanterns in the fog. Others spoke of smugglers, their operations rumored to run along the Maine coast in those years, slipping contraband past watchful eyes under cover of darkness. A few, more superstitious, whispered about ghost ships, convinced the sea had its own ways of claiming men. For Matthew, the talk only deepened his resolve. He spent long nights at the kitchen table, the logbook spread before him, studying every page. He noticed details others overlooked: the shift in his father's handwriting, the pressure of the pen as if Daniel had been writing quickly, and the unusual way the entry ended mid-sentence. It wasn't weather that had rattled him. Something else had happened on that water, and Matthew could feel it in his bones. He began asking questions around town, speaking with the men who had worked the harbor in 1988. Some welcomed him, sharing faded memories of that stormy week, but others grew guarded the moment the Marian Belle was mentioned. An older dock worker admitted he had seen a vessel slip into the harbor late on the night Daniel vanished, one without a flag and crewed by strangers. He hadn't told anyone at the time, fearing trouble. Another claimed he remembered the Coast Guard searching further offshore than usual, as though directed by a lead that never reached the public. Each fragment added to Matthew's unease. If his father had stumbled upon something illicit at sea, it might explain why the Marian Belle had disappeared intact and why no body had ever surfaced. Yet the boat's reappearance after 15 years raised questions of its own. How had it drifted unseen for so long, only to be found locked in ice, as if waiting to be discovered? One evening, as the sun sank behind the harbor and the Marian Belle floated in eerie stillness at the dock, Matthew made himself a quiet vow. He would not allow his father's memory to be buried beneath rumors or fear. Whatever truth the sea had hidden all these years, he was determined to bring it ashore. Matthew's first step was to return to the Marian Belle, hoping that standing where his father once stood might offer some overlooked clue. The boat sat moored in silence, its deck slick with frost, the timbers creaking faintly as the tide shifted beneath it. He climbed aboard with careful steps, the cold air heavy with salt and rust. Inside the cabin, the damp chill clung to everything. The oilskin coat still hung near the door, its folds stiff with age, while Daniel's old pipe rested on the windowsill as though waiting for him to return. Matthew knelt by the navigation console, opening drawers that investigators had already scoured, but perhaps not with a son's eye. He found scraps of paper tucked between manuals, a grocery list written in his mother's handwriting, and a folded letter addressed to Daniel from a supplier in Portland. At first glance, it was ordinary, but the date, just a week before his disappearance, caught Matthew's attention. The letter mentioned a shipment delayed because of coastal interference, and advised Daniel to be cautious of strangers offering cash at the docks. The words struck him hard. It was the first tangible hint that his father might have been pressured or approached before that final voyage. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket, already sensing it could connect with the unfinished log entry. As he lingered in the wheelhouse, he placed his hand on the throttle, remembering how Daniel once guided his smaller hands to teach him the feel of the boat's power. The memory rose vivid and painful, bringing with it the realization that the Marian Belle was not just a vessel, but a time capsule. Everything aboard held echoes of his father's last day, and he needed to treat it as such. That evening, Matthew laid the letter beside the logbook on the kitchen table. His mother sat across from him, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she read the words, her lips tightened. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that men had come around asking questions. I thought it was just idle talk, nothing serious, but maybe—" Her voice trailed off, heavy with regret. For Matthew, it was enough to know his father had not gone willingly into the night. He had walked into something larger, something dangerous, and the Marian Belle was beginning to whisper its story. By the time the Marian Belle had been fully examined, The town was divided between awe and unease. The boat's preservation seemed unnatural, as though the sea itself had decided to hold her secrets until the right moment. Investigators cataloged each item recovered from the cabin, from Daniel's coat to the neatly folded blanket on his bunk, but the most compelling piece remained the logbook and the scattered scraps of paper that hinted at unseen pressures along the coast. Matthew spent his evenings poring over these fragments, trying to connect them with stories he remembered hearing as a boy. He recalled nights when his father came home later than usual, his face drawn and silent, and conversations cut short when Matthew entered the room. Claire, though reluctant at first, admitted she had noticed men loitering near the docks in the weeks before Daniel vanished. They were not locals, and their presence had unsettled her. Daniel had brushed off her concerns at the time, but now, in the shadow of the Marian Belle's return, her memory carried new weight. The Coast Guard announced that the vessel showed no signs of having capsized or been abandoned due to mechanical failure. The engines, though aged, bore no catastrophic damage. It was as if the trawler had been deliberately set adrift or hidden. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered, and whispers of foul play once again spread through Harrington. Matthew walked the length of the docks one evening, the icy wind biting at his cheeks. Old fishermen stopped him to share half-remembered tales. One spoke of hearing a gunshot across the water that October night, muffled by the storm but distinct enough to stay lodged in his memory. Another swore he had seen a vessel with no running lights passing swiftly toward open sea. For years, these fragments had been dismissed as drunken recollections or superstition, but now, with the Marian Belle back in the harbor, they resurfaced with sharp clarity. As Matthew stood on the pier staring at the boat, he felt both closer and further from the truth than ever before. The sea had finally returned his father's trawler, but the silence of its decks only deepened the mystery. It was no longer a question of whether Daniel had been lost to the storm. Something darker had happened that night, and Matthew knew he would have to follow the trail wherever it led. Matthew found himself drawn back to the Marian Belle late at night, when the harbor was quiet and the snow muffled every sound. The boat loomed in the dim glow of the dock lamps, her weathered hull streaked with salt as though she had just returned from a long journey. He stepped aboard carefully, the deck creaking beneath his weight, and let his eyes adjust to the darkness inside the cabin. Everything remained where investigators had left it, but in the stillness, the trawler seemed less like evidence and more like a message waiting to be understood. He sat at the small wooden desk, where his father had written his final entry, and ran his fingers over the grooves in the surface. It felt almost alive beneath his hand, carrying the weight of years and words. A single drawer stuck slightly when he tried to open it, and after a firm tug, it gave way with a snap. Inside was nothing more than a scattering of nails and an old fishing knife, but wedged in the corner was a scrap of oil-stained paper folded tight. Unfolding it carefully, Matthew saw a list written in his father's hand. At first glance, it looked like simple supply notes: rope, fuel, spare parts. But at the bottom, hastily scribbled in smaller letters, were the words, "Meeting unknown vessel must refuse." His pulse quickened as he read it again. It was confirmation that Daniel had been approached and that he had chosen to stand his ground. The next morning he showed the note to Claire. Her hands trembled as she held it, tears welling in her eyes. "He never told me outright," she whispered, "but I knew something was pressing on him. He wanted to protect us from it, and now it seems it cost him everything." The discovery reignited Matthew's determination. If there had been a meeting with another vessel that night, someone in Harrington or beyond must have known about it. Smuggling along the coast was no secret, but tying his father's disappearance to it changed everything. The Marian Belle was no longer simply a ghost ship drifting back into view. It was evidence, and it carried the first clear sign that Daniel Mercer had not been lost to the sea by accident. The small piece of paper Matthew had uncovered quickly became the most significant clue yet, and he carried it folded carefully in his wallet as if afraid it might vanish if he left it behind. He returned to the Coast Guard office the following week, determined to show them what he had found. The officer assigned to the reopened investigation studied the note under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, his brow furrowing at the words. He admitted it aligned with rumors long whispered about smuggling routes that had once threaded the Maine coastline, shadow operations that had flourished in the late 1980s when oversight was thinner and storms provided cover. Matthew pressed for answers, but the officer cautioned him. If your father wrote this, it means he knew more than he should have. People who ran those operations didn't leave loose ends. We'll dig deeper, but you should be careful where you ask questions. The warning only stoked Matthew's determination. He had lived 15 years with silence. He refused to turn away now that the sea had finally returned its first real fragments of truth. That evening, he stopped at the harbor tavern where the oldest fishermen still gathered at the bar, their weathered faces carved with salt and years. At first, they spoke around him, reluctant to revisit a night many had tried to bury, but when he laid the note on the counter and told them it was written by his father, a hush fell. One man, his beard gone white, finally spoke. He remembered a trawler with no running lights slipping along the coast that night, riding too close to shore to be ordinary. Another recalled the Coast Guard's search pattern, oddly focused in a stretch of water no one had expected, as though directed there on purpose. The fragments came slowly, guardedly, but each one added to the picture. Daniel had likely crossed paths with smugglers operating out of hidden coves. He had refused to be bought, and for that, he had become a problem. When Matthew left the tavern, the winter air bit into his lungs, but his mind burned with clarity. His father had not abandoned him, had not been careless with the sea. Daniel Mercer had made a choice, one that cost him his life, and now it was up to his son to make sure that truth finally surfaced. Matthew woke before dawn, unable to shake the weight of the fisherman's words from the night before. The image of a trawler running without lights haunted him, sliding silently along the dark water while his father's vessel labored with a failing engine. It explained too much to be ignored, yet it left a hole larger than before. If such a boat existed, where had it come from, and where had it gone? He drove north along the rugged coastline, pulling off where narrow dirt roads led to secluded coves. These were the kinds of places smugglers could have used hidden from town, shielded from watchful eyes by jagged cliffs and heavy pine. Standing on the frozen shore, Matthew let the wind cut against his face as he imagined the Marian Belle drifting near here all those years ago, his father scribbling those last frantic notes in the logbook while something darker moved through the fog. Later that day, he visited the town library where old maritime records and newspaper clippings were kept in dusty cabinets. Hours passed as he hunched over yellowed pages, searching for anything unusual from the fall of 1988. Finally, he found a small article, barely more than a paragraph, noting an unidentified vessel reported off the coast that October, seen by a lighthouse keeper who claimed it did not answer hails on the radio. At the time, it was dismissed as a foreign fishing boat straying off course, but Matthew felt a chill as he read. It was another piece, aligning too closely with his father's final words to ignore. He copied the clipping and added it to his growing collection of evidence. Each scrap told the same story, though never in full. His father had crossed paths with something illicit, and that something had erased him from the sea. That night, Matthew sat with his mother at the kitchen table, spreading the papers out like puzzle pieces. Claire listened quietly, her eyes wet, before speaking in a trembling voice. "Your father wasn't a man who bent easily. If they asked him to be part of it, I know what he would have said. He would have stood his ground." Her certainty was both a comfort and a sorrow. Daniel Mercer had likely paid with his life for that refusal, but Matthew felt a new resolve stirring. The truth was no longer buried at sea. It was close, just beyond reach, waiting to be brought to the surface. Snow fell in steady sheets the morning Matthew returned to the harbor to meet with the Coast Guard investigator assigned to the Marian Belle. The boat sat moored under a thin crust of ice, her lines groaning as the tide shifted, and for a moment he simply stared at her, imagining his father's last moments inside that wheelhouse. The investigator, a grizzled man named Keating, joined him on the dock carrying a folder thick with photographs and reports. Keating explained that the boat's condition told an unusual story. The engines, while old, had not failed catastrophically. The nets were neatly stowed, not cut or tangled as they might have been in a storm. Even the small coffee pot in the galley still sat upright, its enamel chipped but intact. "It's as if whoever was aboard left in a hurry," Keating said, his eyes narrowing, "but not because of the sea." Matthew showed him the note he had found tucked in the drawer, the words about refusing a meeting with an unknown vessel. Keating studied it for a long time before sliding it into the folder. "This lines up with chatter we've heard over the years," he admitted. "Smuggling along this coast was bigger than most folks knew. Your father might have been approached to carry something, or at the very least to keep quiet about what he saw. If he refused, that could have made him a target." The thought sat heavy between them as the snow hissed against the dock. Matthew asked if that meant his father had been murdered. Keating didn't answer directly, only muttering that cases like these rarely ended cleanly. "But now," he added, "we have his boat, his words, and the fact that she's been preserved all these years. That's more than we've ever had, and it means someone out there knows exactly what happened." Walking back toward town, Matthew felt the cold settle deep in his bones. For so long he had carried the weight of uncertainty, the ache of not knowing if his father had drowned, run away, or simply vanished into legend. Now, the pieces were shifting. The Marian Belle had not been lost to chance. It had been silenced, hidden, and returned when time finally forced the ice to give her up. For Matthew, that truth was both terrifying and clarifying. The sea had held its secret long enough. Now it was his turn to confront it. Matthew could not shake the feeling that the Marian Belle had been deliberately hidden, not lost. The thought gnawed at him as he walked the narrow streets of Harrington, past weather-beaten houses and the glow of the tavern where locals still whispered about the boat's return. Each conversation seemed to circle the same point, that Daniel Mercer had known something he should not have, and that knowledge had sealed his fate. That evening, Matthew sought out Elijah Briggs, the trapper who had first discovered the trawler frozen in ice. Elijah lived in a small cabin at the edge of town, the smell of wood smoke heavy in the air. Over a cup of strong coffee, Matthew asked him to recount exactly what he saw. Elijah leaned back, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug, and said the ice that morning had shifted strangely, almost as if something beneath it had been forced up by the current. "Boats don't just vanish and come back like that," Elijah muttered. "It was like she'd been kept someplace still and cold all these years, then pushed out where we could find her." The words lodged in Matthew's mind. If the Marian Belle had not been drifting, then where had she been? The coastline was jagged with hidden inlets, some known only to those who worked them. Could his father's boat have been deliberately stashed away, sealed off in some forgotten cove until time or accident revealed her? When he left Elijah's cabin, the night was clear, the stars sharp over the dark water. Matthew stood on the bluff and tried to imagine what his father had faced. A strange vessel with its lights off, men who had no ties to the town, an offer made and refused. He thought of the note, the clipped words scrawled in haste, and felt certain Daniel had known danger was closing in. Back home, Claire was waiting in the kitchen, her hands folded tight on the table. She looked up at her son, her eyes filled with the quiet strength of someone who had endured too much. "If you find the truth," she said softly, "promise me it won't destroy you the way losing him destroyed me." Matthew placed a hand over hers, his voice steady. "I don't want revenge, Mom. I just want his story told right." And in that moment, he knew he would not stop until it was. Matthew began spending more time at the harbor archives, a drafty room tucked above the old customs office where records from decades past were kept in long wooden cabinets. He combed through shipping manifests, patrol logs, and lighthouse reports from the fall of 1988, determined to trace the shadow that had crossed his father's path. The work was slow, the papers brittle and yellowed, but he felt his father's presence with each page turned, as though Daniel's voice urged him forward. One afternoon, Matthew uncovered a ledger from the harbor master that noted an unusual clearance given to a foreign-flagged vessel the week his father disappeared. The name of the boat was listed only as Laurel Crown, and beside it was a handwritten remark, "Docked briefly after dark, left before dawn." No details of cargo were listed, no destination noted. It was a ghost entry, something that should never have passed through official records without scrutiny. Matthew took the page to Keating, who studied it with narrowed eyes. "That name's come up before," the investigator admitted quietly. "There were whispers of a ship running contraband up the coast, but it always managed to slip away before anyone could pin it down. If your father saw it, he might have realized more than they wanted him to." The thought that Daniel's final night might have intersected with a smuggler's operation filled Matthew with both pride and dread. Pride that his father had refused whatever offer was made to him, and dread knowing such refusal might have cost him his life. That evening, Matthew returned to the Marian Belle, the cold air settling into the timbers as though the boat still carried the memory of that night. He stood in the wheelhouse, imagining the sight of the Laurel Crown sliding silently through the fog, its crew watching as his father scribbled hurried notes in his logbook. It was no accident. His father had been silenced because he stood in the way. The pieces were aligning. But Matthew understood the danger too. If the Laurel Crown had operated with such secrecy, then its backers were powerful, perhaps even connected to men still living quietly in Harrington. As the boat creaked in the tide beneath him, he knew the truth would not only uncover the past, but stir shadows that some would rather keep buried forever. Matthew carried the harbor master's ledger with him like a talisman, proof that his father's final night had been tangled with something larger than a storm. The name Laurel Crown circled in his thoughts until it felt etched into him, a shadow ship that had drifted through the records and disappeared as easily as it had come. Determined to know more, he began asking around the docks, carefully probing men who had been working there in 1988. Most claimed no memory of the vessel, their faces tightening at the mention of it, but one finally lowered his voice and admitted he had seen its crew unloading crates under the cover of fog. He had kept quiet out of fear, he said, because men who asked questions in those days had a way of regretting it. The account rattled Matthew but also steeled him. He realized his father must have seen the same unloading and refused to turn a blind eye. The note about "must refuse" now felt heavier, the last evidence of a decision that sealed Daniel's fate. Keating agreed the lead was strong enough to dig further. He explained that the Laurel Crown had been tied to smuggling operations stretching from Canada down the coast, moving contraband and occasionally people. Its sudden appearance in Harrington the week Daniel vanished was no coincidence. If Daniel had confronted them or simply refused to cooperate, he had likely been eliminated quickly, his boat taken and hidden until the operation itself dissolved years later. That night, Matthew returned home to find his mother sitting in the living room, the old family photo album open across her lap. She traced Daniel's face in the photographs, her eyes wet. "He always told me the sea could be cruel," she whispered, "but I don't think it was the sea that took him." Her words cut through him with clarity. She had carried the suspicion for years, but never spoken it aloud. Matthew knelt beside her, resting a hand on her arm. "It wasn't the sea, Mom," he said quietly. "I think he was standing up to something bigger, and now we finally have a way to prove it." For the first time in 15 years, she nodded, not in hope, but in recognition. The truth was no longer a rumor. It was taking shape, and it demanded to be brought fully into the light. Matthew began piecing together a map of the coastline, marking every cove, inlet, and hidden stretch of shore where a vessel like the Laurel Crown could have anchored undetected. Old charts lay spread across the kitchen table, their edges curled with age, while the logbook and his father's note sat nearby, like anchors pulling him back to that night. He studied tidal patterns, the direction of the storm, and reports from lighthouse keepers. Slowly, he began to see a path, a corridor where the smuggler's ship could have slipped in and out without drawing attention. The next day, he walked those stretches of coast, his boots crunching over snow and frozen seaweed. The air carried the raw bite of winter, but he pushed on, imagining what his father might have seen as he steered the Marian Belle along these same waters. In one narrow cove, sheltered by high cliffs, Matthew noticed the remnants of an old dock half buried in ice. Weathered posts jutted from the water like broken teeth, and rusted chains still dangled where something larger had once been secured. It was the kind of place that could swallow a ship whole, unseen from the Maine harbor. Later, he brought Keating to the site, and the investigator studied it with careful eyes. This would have been perfect, he admitted. Out of sight, deep enough water to handle a vessel that size, and easy access to the back roads. If your father stumbled onto activity here, it would explain everything. Divers were dispatched once the ice thinned, and they confirmed traces of heavy mooring consistent with a larger ship, along with fragments of crates long rotted by salt water. The confirmation chilled Matthew more than it satisfied him. Each discovery narrowed the truth but also sharpened the loss. His father hadn't been swallowed by the sea, he had been silenced for standing in its way. That evening, Claire lit a lantern on the kitchen windowsill, something she had done in the early years after Daniel vanished, but abandoned when hope faded. The soft glow spilled into the snow outside, a quiet signal that she too was ready to face what had always haunted her. Matthew stood beside her, the shadows of the past flickering in the light, and understood they were no longer just chasing rumors. The pieces of his father's story were finally surfacing, one tide at a time. The discovery of the hidden cove sent ripples through Harrington. For the first time, speculation gave way to tangible proof that something unlawful had unfolded the night Daniel disappeared. The Coast Guard released no official statement, but word spread quickly among the townsfolk, and whispers grew louder in the tavern and along the docks. Men who had once dismissed the story now avoided Matthew's gaze, while others looked at him with a quiet respect, as though the truth about his father was finally being acknowledged. Matthew could not stay away from the Marian Belle. Each time he stepped aboard, he felt closer to the man he had lost, though the silence within the cabin weighed heavily on him. On one visit he noticed the hatch to the lower storage hold had been overlooked in earlier searches. With effort, he pried it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the space smelled of damp salt and oil, but among the empty crates and coils of rope, he found something out of place. A small metal box, wedged behind a beam, coated in rust but intact. He carried it back to the house and worked it open with careful hands. Inside were papers sealed in waxed envelopes, the edges swollen from years of moisture. Some were receipts for fuel and supplies, ordinary records of his father's careful bookkeeping, but one envelope contained a letter written in Daniel's hand. The words were brief, hurried, and unfinished, yet they confirmed what Matthew already feared. Daniel had written of being approached by men offering money for silence. "Cannot agree." The letter ended abruptly, the ink blurred as though the pen had been snatched away. Matthew showed the letter to Keating, who regarded it grimly. "This is enough to press further," he said. "Your father wasn't just unlucky, he was targeted." The investigator promised to trace the Laurel Crown's ties, even if it meant revisiting cold files long thought useless. That night, Matthew sat with the letter spread out before him, the ink faded but his father's voice clear in every word. He realized Daniel had chosen principle over safety, integrity over compromise, and in doing so had walked directly into danger. The pain of that truth cut deeply, but it also brought a strange sense of pride. His father had not vanished into mystery, he had stood against something greater, and now his story was demanding to be told. Winter loosened its grip slowly, and as the ice along the coast began to crack and retreat, Matthew felt the investigation shifting as well. The letter from his father had given weight to the whispers, transforming them into evidence that could no longer be ignored. Keating began reaching out to federal contacts, digging into shipping records that had been dormant for years. The name Laurel Crown appeared sporadically in reports, often in connection with suspicious movements between ports, always vanishing before inspectors could close in. For Matthew, Each new detail cut deeper into the fabric of his father's last days. He walked through town with the letter folded in his coat pocket, a constant reminder of Daniel's choice. Some townsfolk now approached him cautiously, offering fragments of memory they had been too afraid to share years earlier. One woman recalled seeing strangers at the harbor that week, their truck idling at the edge of the pier long after dark. Another remembered her husband coming home unsettled, muttering that something about the search for the Marian Belle had never felt right. The stories lined up too closely to dismiss. Daniel had been caught in the middle of something vast and secret, and Harrington itself had been brushed by its shadow. Yet as more people spoke, Matthew noticed something else. Fear still lingered. Their voices dropped when the laurel crown was mentioned, and eyes flicked nervously toward the door, as though the past might still come knocking. At night, Matthew sat by the kitchen window with Claire, watching the lantern she had begun lighting again. She told him that for years she had dreamed of Daniel's return, but now she simply wanted peace. "I think he knew what was at stake," she said softly. "If he refused them, it was because he couldn't be anything less than the man he was." Her words settled heavily in Matthew's chest. The pride she spoke of was undeniable, but so too was the sorrow of knowing that principle had left them without a husband and father. The Marian Belle remained tied at the dock, her worn hull creaking with each tide. To others, she was just a recovered vessel, a relic of tragedy. To Matthew, she was a witness, silent but steadfast, holding the truth like the sea itself, reluctant to give it up, but incapable of erasing it forever. Spring crept over the coast with hesitant warmth, but for Matthew, the thaw brought no comfort. The investigation into the Laurel Crown was widening, drawing in names that had once belonged only to rumor. Keating shared what little he could, mentioning that certain shipping routes had been flagged in the late 1980s, routes tied to contraband moving under the cover of fishing vessels. The more Matthew listened, the clearer it became that his father had stumbled directly into a network larger than their town, perhaps larger than the state itself. One evening, Matthew returned to the hidden cove where the rotted pilings jutted like ribs from the water. The ice was gone now, and the tide lapped quietly at the shore. He crouched near the remains of the dock, running his fingers along the rusted chain links, still bolted into stone. It was easy to imagine another vessel moored here years ago, its crew working swiftly under the fog, their shadows crossing paths with his father's. He pictured Daniel steering the Marian Belle into view, his stubborn resolve flashing in his eyes as he refused to turn away. Back in town, the whispers about the Marian Belle had shifted. No longer was Daniel dismissed as reckless or unlucky. People began to speak of him with a different tone, as a man who had chosen honesty even when faced with danger. That shift filled Matthew with pride, but it also deepened his grief. He wanted to carry his father's name restored, but he also wanted the justice that had been denied for 15 years. Claire remained quiet through much of it, but one evening she brought out an old journal Matthew had never seen before. It contained small notes Daniel had written at home, lists, reminders, scraps of thoughts. In the back pages, a line stood out: "Storm coming, strangers watching, must stay firm." Reading it, Matthew felt the same sharp pang he had felt when holding the letter from the boat. His father had known the risk, and still he had not bent. Matthew closed the journal gently, his throat tight. The Marian Belle had not returned by chance. She was a reminder, a testament, and perhaps even a warning. The sea had carried her back, so the truth could no longer be hidden. And Matthew knew the next step was to ensure that the men behind it were no longer hidden either. The arrival of spring storms rattled the windows of Harrington and sent the harbor into uneasy motion, waves slapping against the pier as though echoing the restlessness building in Matthew's chest. Each day, he felt the weight of his father's story pressing harder, the fragments of evidence no longer scattered, but forming a picture too clear to ignore. The logbook, the letter tucked in the cabin, the harbor ledger, and now the journal entry, each piece spoke of a man who had stood his ground against forces that thrived in secrecy. Keating called one afternoon to tell him federal agents were reviewing the material. Smuggling rings had long since shifted or dissolved, but names were still surfacing, names that linked to men who had lived in Harrington and worn the mask of respectability. For Matthew, it was both vindication and fury. If some of these men had known what happened to his father and kept silent, then the town itself had been complicit in burying him. That night Matthew walked the docks, the salt air thick with the smell of kelp and diesel. Lanterns swayed in the wind, casting broken shadows across the water. He stopped at the slip where the Marian Belle rested, her hull weathered but strong, her presence impossible to ignore. He placed a hand on the railing, speaking softly as if his father could still hear him. "They thought they could erase you, but you're still here." At home, Claire waited in her chair by the window, the journal on her lap. She looked up at her son and asked quietly, "Will it ever be enough, even if they admit what happened?" Matthew hesitated before answering. "Enough to clear his name, yes. Enough to fill the years we lost, no. But I can't let him be remembered as a man who vanished without cause." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "Then finish what he started." The storm outside grew louder, rain lashing against the glass, yet Matthew felt a calm settle over him. The truth was no longer an illusion on the horizon. It was here, pushing against the silence, demanding to be spoken. His father's boat had come back not to haunt them, but to guide them, and Matthew knew that when the storm broke, he would be ready to follow its lead. Matthew was summoned to the Coast Guard station on a gray morning when the fog hung low over the harbor, muffling every sound. Keating met him at the door, his face lined with exhaustion, but carrying the gravity of someone who had finally found the thread to pull. Inside, folders lay open across the table, each one filled with grainy photographs, faded reports, and names Matthew recognized from town. Among them were men who had run businesses along the docks in the late 1980s, men who had since aged into pillars of the community. Keating explained that several of these men had ties to the Laurel Crown, funneling supplies, fuel, and cover through Harrington to keep the ship's operations hidden. It was a quiet arrangement, lucrative for those who participated and dangerous for anyone who refused. Daniel Mercer's name was never written in those files, but his refusal was clear enough in the scraps of evidence left behind. "Your father wasn't just unlucky," Keating said firmly. "He stood in their way, and they made sure he never came home." The words hit Matthew like a blow. For 15 years he had lived with the ache of uncertainty, the gnawing doubt that his father might have drowned, abandoned them, or been forgotten by the sea. Now, at last, there was clarity. It did not lessen the loss, but it stripped away the shadows. Daniel had been silenced not by the ocean's cruelty, but by human hands. That evening, Matthew walked with his mother along the edge of the harbor. The wind cut sharp, carrying the scent of brine and smoke, but Claire walked steadily, her arm looped through her son's. He told her what Keating had revealed, watching as her lips pressed into a thin line. "I knew he would never leave us," she whispered. "Not Daniel, not your father. He chose to be the man he always was, even when it cost him everything." They stopped at the slip where the Marian Belle rocked gently against her ropes, a ghostly silhouette in the fog. For the first time, Matthew felt he was no longer staring at a question but at an answer. His father's boat had returned to ensure his story was told, and Matthew vowed silently that no one in Harrington would forget the truth again. The following days brought a flurry of movement in Harrington as federal investigators began to arrive quietly, their unmarked cars stirring whispers along the narrow streets. Keating met with Matthew in hushed tones, explaining that the evidence tied to the Laurel Crown and the men in town would finally be pursued. "It will take time," he warned, "but the walls are closing in." For Matthew, it was the first glimpse of justice, though it carried no triumph, only the somber knowledge of how much had already been lost. He spent hours aboard the Marian Belle, walking the length of the deck, running his hand over the rail his father had once leaned on. The boat seemed less like a crime scene now, and more like a shrine, holding within her timbers the weight of Daniel's choices, Each creak of the hull against the tide felt like a reminder that his father's strength had not been erased. One evening, Claire joined him on the dock. She moved slowly, bundled against the cold, her eyes fixed on the vessel that had defined so much of her life. Matthew helped her aboard, and together they stood in the wheelhouse, the lantern light flickering across weathered wood. "He used to hum in here," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Even on stormy nights he'd hum, so I wouldn't worry. I can almost hear it now." Matthew rested a hand on her shoulder. "He didn't bend, Mom. He chose to stand against them." Claire nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "That was Daniel," she whispered. "Always stubborn, always honest. And now everyone will finally know it." When they left the boat, the harbor was quiet, the tide lapping gently against the pier. Matthew glanced back once more, the silhouette of the Marian Belle framed against the dark water. For the first time since her return, he did not feel haunted. Instead, he felt guided, as if his father had steered her back from the silence of the sea to ensure his story was told. The investigation was far from over, but Matthew understood something had already shifted. The truth was no longer buried beneath waves or hidden in fear. It was surfacing, carried by the same tide that had brought the Marian Belle home. The day of the memorial came quietly, without fanfare, just as Daniel would have wanted. The townsfolk gathered along the harbor, their breath rising in the cool spring air, their eyes drawn to the Marian Belle resting in her slip. For years she had been a ghost, a story whispered with pity or suspicion, but now she was a witness restored to the living, her presence undeniable. Matthew stood beside his mother at the edge of the pier, the folded letter from his father tucked safely inside his jacket. He had read it countless times, each word etched into his memory, each line proof that Daniel Mercer had not vanished without cause, but had chosen integrity when others demanded silence. The minister spoke briefly, his voice carrying over the water. He spoke not only of loss but of resolve, of how a man's legacy was not measured in the years he lived, but in the choices he made when tested. Claire clutched Matthew's arm tightly, her eyes fixed on the boat as though she could still see her husband at the wheel. Around them, old fishermen bowed their heads, some weeping openly, others standing rigid in shame for having doubted him. The air was heavy, but for the first time it did not feel empty. When the service ended, Matthew stepped aboard the Marian Belle one last time. He walked into the wheelhouse, letting his hand rest on the worn throttle, and whispered into the silence, "They will remember you right, Dad. I promise." The hum of the tide against the hull felt like an answer, steady and unwavering. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Matthew and Claire remained. She lit the lantern she had placed in the window so many nights before, only this time she set it at the bow of the Marian Belle. The glow reflected off the water, a beacon not of waiting but of remembrance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthew felt something shift inside him. The ache of uncertainty that had followed him since boyhood eased, replaced by a solemn pride. His father's story was no longer an unfinished tale lost to the sea. It was whole, carried forward by those who loved him, and by a son who refused to let silence be the final word. The Marian Belle rocked gently in the darkening harbor, her truth at last set free.